Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I am one of the co-hosts.
I'm Kate.
I am Will.
I'm Luke.
And joining us today to discuss part 2 of Against the Day, Iceland Spar, along with everything else that we just want to talk about because we love talking to him, is friend of the show, Brett Biebel. Brett, thank you so much for hanging out with us.
I was really hoping to be introduced as friend of the show. So,
well, you are.
Thank you.
I think if anybody has earned the 5th co-host spot at this point, it is you. You are our like multi-appearance co-host at this point. So you're as much a part of the show, I think, as any of us. We couldn't have done Mason and Dixon how we did Mason and Dixon without you. So.
Oh, good Lord, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, same to y'all. It was a joy to listen every week, and it always is. So glad to be a part of it. Thank you for inviting me in.
And for anyone who has not listened to our Mason and Dixon coverage, whether you've read the book or not, Brett is the author of the Mason and Dixon Companion, which is an amazing companion piece to have when you are reading the book. A lot of historical facts in there that will add a lot of cohesion and a lot of context to that book in particular. So find a copy wherever you can and grab it because it is very worthwhile to have. So I guess the best place to start for this is acknowledging firstly that we've been reading this section of the book for almost a year, I think. Mm-hmm. It has been a significant amount of time. But I guess we should just start where we always start with, which is how has everyone felt about part 2?
Well, I kind of prefigured my comments on part 2 in the last episode a little bit. So for lack of any sort of new originality, I guess I'll repeat some of what I said there. The biggest thing is that so this book is both the easiest Pynchon book to read and the hardest in my experience, in that his prose and the sort of general readability of the words on the page and his storytelling is incredibly digestible in a way that is really quite remarkable. But that I think is also really important because the longer that we've read this book, the more that I've kind of come around to the opinion that Against the Day can almost be viewed as a Rosetta Stone for the rest of Pynchon's writing, in the sense that it really gives the reader who's reading closely and analyzing the things that he's bringing up in the book a fundamental kind of reshaping of their worldview if they haven't already arrived at a lot of the similar positions that Pynchon as an author has. But, even if they already are in that position, teaching them about these cycles of history that he spends so much time over the course of his career writing about. And I think it's important that this book is so readable because it does allow someone who doesn't want to read any of the rest of his books for some fucking reason to just read this one. Mm-hmm. And if they do the work and if they grasp the content, then I think really they'll fully understand the purpose of his oeuvre. And I kind of start there in my comments because I think that that's both successful and not successful. One, in the sense that, yes, it is, as I've mentioned, amongst the most easily readable books that he's put together, but it's also the most difficult because of the amount of historical research and kind of fact-finding that you would have to do alongside it. Now, that can be super rewarding. You can come out of the other end of Iceland Spar knowing all about like the development of land ownership rights in Ireland and the development of industrial labor unions in the United States and different sort of anarchist movements and counter forces working against them in a variety of countries. And you'll also learn about the development of a bunch of different maths and sciences and philosophy and sort of secret societies. Like it is truly encyclopedic in a way that a lot of encyclopedic novels don't always necessarily grasp. It's not hyper focused. It's got a broad focus, but that's very demanding of the reader. And I don't know if the argument is as successful or if his kind of thesis is as successful to someone who is not doing that work. And so I think that that's part of what can kind of make it hard to read is if you're engaging in all of that additional research and secondary source reading and everything that Pynchon so clearly wants the reader to do. And then also, me and Will towards the end of Iceland Spar mentioned a couple times where he restates his argument over and over again, in a way that I don't think is totally usual for him. David Foster Wallace had a quote in an interview, I believe it's his Charlie Rose interview, where he says that his biggest problem as a writer is that he feels like he hasn't been understood, so he ends up falling into a trap of restating the same thing over and over and over again until he just exhausts his audience. And I think that, especially with some of the details in this chunk of the book, like the Iceland Spar mineral itself, I was sort of experiencing some fatigue towards the end. There were points in the end, like when we see Iceland Spar sort of natural and unmined in the chapter with the peyote trip, where he kind of like pulled me back in again. But broadly, especially in the last 100 pages or so, my feeling was really like, I got it, man. we can we can move forward a little bit. We can stop with the setup. And of course, it massively redeems some of that slog with the way that it ends. All the stuff with the intruder and the Canberra University segment and everything. So for me, it's really up and down. But I've never. I also said this on the last episode. I've never read a book so closely in my entire life. So it's also just been a very rewarding experience from that perspective, where I truly feel like there's not anything I'm missing necessarily, other than maybe some of the more like really experimental stuff that you maybe don't need to fully grasp to understand the book as a whole.
Sure.
But that early period of the 1900s, man, I got it. I got it. I got it cold in my head now.
I think it's really interesting to hear you talk through that, Kate, because I think this is maybe my favorite section of the book. And I'm not, but it's also, you're right, because the stuff in Against the Day that's the most opaque to me is the European spy stuff, which is often the most opaque stuff in all of Pynchon. I think more of that comes later in the book. But the second thing is the math, just the math and the electricity. I have what he's talking about most of the time. But I think the storylines in this section, whether it's Kit and Dahlia, or the sort of Travers family, revenge saga. I think those were the parts where it really sort of felt like the book got a lot of juice for me. And so I think when I think back about Against the Day, those are the things that really stand out. And in part, maybe it is because that labor history is fascinating to me. I do agree with you though. Like, I think this book being too long is a generally good critique. And that probably comes through in this section. But some of the just the writing and the character work that gets done here, and maybe that's because there's a lot of sort of kind of Mason and Dixon stylistic similarity. Just writing about the West more than what was then the West, but is now the East. The Mason and Dixon line. There's some just sort of overlap there that I think maybe just speaks to who I am as a reader. So I think my emotional response to this section is really strong. But the things you're talking about in terms of like the repetitiveness or the way it gets dense in ways you don't expect, and maybe in some strange places, definitely gels with my experience.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Brett. I think for me, it's I really enjoy throughout the book. I enjoy the history lessons, the math, the physics, all the science and real life things that are just tossed in there. But I think what really makes this, not just this section of the book, but I think this book in general, my favorite of his works, is just the sheer pleasure of reading it. And I think a lot of that is just attributable to his ability to write in these different genres so well. It never feels like pastiche. It never feels schlocky. And if it does, he's doing it on purpose to further the story and to kind of play with these tropes and these genres. But there's a clear love for the Western, for the boys adventure novel, for the thriller, for the crime novel. Like there's all of this, this is that rare case I think of kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, but it all kind of sticks and it all works. There are certainly parts of it where it kind of, it does drag a little bit, and its length sometimes is a disservice to itself. But I think at the end of the day, I just enjoy the journey that we're going on enough that I can overlook that and just, really just lose myself in the world that he's created here. Um, and then, just the prose is, as always is with Pynchon, is beautiful. Especially in his Western scenes. I think that's when he's really shining a great light on a genre that is usually not appreciated very well, and really showing his love for how that particular genre can work in the right hands, like, especially with evocative scene setting and tension building. Like we talked at length about the scene where Sloat was killed and
Mhm.
how intense that was for such a short piece of the chapter, but it was so efficiently done. And I would be hard pressed to find another author who can really do that with that particular genre as well as he has done it in this book.
Of all the mini novels inside this novel, I mean, I think part of why I like is that what you said, Cody, that Western, the sort of the Travers family Western
Yeah,
is
yeah.
just trans it's awesome, and it really kind of vibes with the stuff that I like to read, and it's also maybe as plotty as Pynchon gets.
Yeah, that's for
And
sure, absolutely,
and
yeah.
and so it of a writer where, oh, he does have a bag, and it just yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, I mean, what I have to say about this part, I guess, can be summarized as it's a lot of action on, and this is going to sound, because I'm who I am, it's going to sound like an insult, but it's not meant that way. There's a lot of action on the surface, and I mean this literally. Like, there's a lot of action being done by people living their lives, and a lot is happening. A lot of life is happening on the pages, and that plot, if you're reading through it, is really satisfying and really engulfing. And like the theme that is there, I think if you are not doing that dense research that we all have been doing to some extent or another, but you in particular have been kind of drowning in, Kate. I think that when you're not doing all of the research that maybe you can, it it builds all of the thematic content that's within the normal human level of the novel kind of emerges in a subtler way, less well founded, less like, oh, he's pointing at this event and he's pointing at these trends, and more, well, okay, this is the feeling that's happening, and these are why these people are acting in this way that in hindsight feels crazy, because when you look at World War One from a modern 21st century perspective, it seems absolutely deranged. Um, and the thing is that, like, when I read the book for the first time, I read through this first 500 pages or so very quickly and got to exactly this last section in our last episode and just kind of stalled, not ran out of steam on the book. In fact, I was more enthusiastic than ever, but I felt like, oh my god, there's so much depth going on here. There's so much
Mhm.
density. How can I not try to engage with it as much as possible? And I didn't do that with research, but I did that, trying to puzzle things out in the way that I do. And that's when I stopped loving the thematic side of this book as much my first time through. And so I think that might be a failure on our part to some extent. Just trying to get it done sooner than the author maybe wants us to.
Mm.
At the same time, that doesn't mean that it doesn't feel like we've been talking about the same damn idea over and over again for the past 150, 300 pages. And that doesn't mean that that's all that it is either, because, like y'all said, like the Traverse family saga is really beautiful. Even and kind of, I think maybe another part that makes this second part of the book so ugly to me in like an aesthetic, like a broad strokes aesthetic sense, is that like we got so much hope in the first part, and the second part is not like everything's tattered, and it's not that everything is lost, even though there is some major loss. Like it ends on a high note if we're really being honest about like traditional plot dynamics. It's just like heavy. Like everything that happens with Lake is awful. What happens to Stray is not good as much as like she's tough and she'll get through it. She's probably regretting a lot of things for good reason. Frank is not doing anything he wants to be doing, even though he's not exactly running for his life. He's also not exactly not doing that. It's just all of that beauty that is around those characters doesn't seem to actually touch them, and that's, I think, a sad component of otherwise really lovely scenes.
Yeah, I do think I'm going to enjoy the book way more the second time that I read it.
When it doesn't take you 4 years.
Yeah, and I already have all of the information in my head.
Mhm.
But I'm sorry, I cut you off, Cody.
No, I was just telling Will that I think that's a really interesting perspective that I hadn't considered, that all the beauty around the Traverse family that doesn't ever touch them. It's a really interesting way to look at that, and I really like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's you want them to do well, and it's not just because they're like the good guys.
Oh, right.
It's also because they are like well fleshed out enough that they feel like believable characters, and if you wanna be lame and imagine them as real people, you can do that, and you get invested and you want them to succeed because they're, first of all, kind of cool,
Mhm.
and also just like you can tell that they're in the middle. They're in the middle of things in a very salient way on that broader thematic level, and yet it's the same thematic level for 200 pages. It's just a little bit much if you sit here and read 30 pages at a pace of, one, well, not 30 pages. If you sit here and read the 200 pages at a pace of like 2 a day.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so funny to say this, but so much of my challenge with reading Pinchon over the course of my life is learning when to like turn off the need to know more and when to just go with it, and when
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
chase down every single detail. And obviously, I'm not very good at that because the Mason and Dixon Companion came out.
Yeah.
But like there are certain times it's less useful or fun to that book is written for particular moods and probably particular readers, particular reads through the book.
Mhm.
I think maybe part of why I like this section so much is because it was a section that I stopped feeling the need to chase everything down, and and just was able to enjoy the ride. And I think it's hard to do that when you're podcasting about the book, right?
Yeah.
So I think all that. Love the way you put it too. Just there's so much beauty that doesn't touch them. I think that's quite profound.
Luke, what about you? What are your thoughts on part 2?
Yeah, I think what I focused on most when I've looked back on this section is just how kind of kaleidoscopic it is, which we've touched on a little bit already in this episode, but just to kind of list some of the genres and stuff it goes over. I mean, we have like a monster movie type thing at the beginning with the aftermath of the Bormance expedition. We have, the Western revenge plot with the Webb and his sons revenging Webb's death. We have erotica stuff with Lake and her two lovers, and romance with Lake and her two lovers, and then also between Kit and Stray. We have like political intrigue, like conspiracy, occult conspiracy type stuff with Lou and the Twit and the twins, Neville and Nigel. We have all the different stuff with the chums, which is kind of like an adventure novel, I guess. We have like the crazy inventor stuff with Tesla. I mean, this section especially plays with a lot of different tropes and a lot of different cliches and stuff like that. And it's just kind of amazing to me that it covers as much ground as it does in I think it's about 300 pages. of this
Something like that.
section.
It's close to that, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to say that this is kind of getting into the future in the book. I want to say part 3 is where a lot of people kind of get bogged down, and then it kind of gains steam again with part 4. And I do think I remember from my first read of this book that I think part 4 was my favorite, and I also love the ending as well, which is a very short section. So my enjoyment of this book mainly kind of gathers steam as I go through it and as I went through it in the past. That being said, this section is pretty great. And I do like what Kate was saying with it kind of being a Rosetta Stone for the rest of Pynchon's books in terms of, it's kind of the most direct distillation of his politics. It's kind of the one book you can read and be like, oh, I came away from this book with a, like, I personally think that if Pynchon wouldn't call himself an anarchist, he would at least admit to having empathy for anarchists and anarchism, and
for
kind
sure.
of having an affinity for it even if he's not a card carrying anarchist. Yeah, and I mean, it's also, this is maybe getting into a little bit into spoiler territories, but it is kind of amazing to me that people like Cyprian haven't really shown up yet. Has Cyprian shown up yet?
No, he hasn't.
Nope.
That is a
Yeah.
part 3 character.
And he's a major character in this book, and a
Yeah.
character that a lot of scholarship focuses on. He's maybe my favorite character in the book, at least one of my favorite characters. And yeah, as much as I love this section, there's stuff to come that is even better somehow. And this section is better than the one that came before it, I would say. Where the first section, I think the first section is only set in America. The second section has stuff in Europe, stuff at the poles, and stuff in America. And I think we get even more locations in 3, 4, and 5.
It opens up a little more, yeah.
Yeah, but the kind of the lens is kind of continuously opening up as you read through this book, where it kind of gives more and more widescreen. But yeah, I guess those are my basic thoughts. Is just kind of amazement in how much ground it covers, how many genres it kind of goes over, and just how well it does all of those things.
So something I wanted to kind of discuss a little further that we started touching on in the last episode of I think it was chapters 30 and 31, is the sort of I hesitate to use the word hate, but I feel like in a lot of the online discourse on Reddit, on Discord, the Pynchon community, there seems to be a sort of almost universal disdain for the Chums of Chance. I think a lot of people see those characters and those parts of the book as being unnecessarily goofy, filler, that the characters aren't really doing anything to further the story. And I know in the last episode I mentioned that I think in this read through I've always liked the Chums sections, but I feel like my appreciation and my understanding of their purpose in the story has really solidified in this reading. I think mainly because we are reading it so closely, and because I'm able to really start putting all these connections together, and how they are, in a way, I think they are the sort of through line for everything else that's happening. They are, despite the amount of time they spend in the air, they are really what's grounding a lot of the story. And I think it's why we open the book with them. I think their existence in this world is way more necessary than a lot of people. I don't want to say people don't understand it. I think they're just not willing to allow it in a weird way. I don't know if any of y'all agree with that, but I think my ultimate point here is that I just feel like the Chums and their sections of this book are grossly underappreciated, and maybe aren't really fully seen for being as important as they really are to the story itself.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I'll beg to differ, I guess, on one note, and that is that I do think that the Chums themselves are annoying. But
They are.
They're supposed to be like,
Right.
and not just as like, oh, it's grating. Why it's supposed to be grating? Rub your nose a little more. More, they're goofy. They're silly. They're supposed to be a little annoying sometimes. They're kids. And aside from that, I completely agree. In fact, I would diagnose all the people who wrongfully hate them with having characterization brainworms. They want the characters to feel real on the page. And that's your job, damn it. How often does
Yeah.
Pynchon have to make that clear? You have to consider it for yourself and figure out what it would be like to be the characters. He's given you what's happening. You figure it out. And, if you try to figure it out with them, you have to think pretty hard, and it's kind of gross when you do, because it's a disturbing concept to be that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you as well, Cody. I mean, I think because of the way that this novel is always laid out to me, it's sort of like those four-dimensional chessboards, right? Or three-dimensional chessboards, or things are
Yeah.
happening on multiple levels, and the level that the chums are on feels really central to the whole story and to a lot of Pynchon's big ideas throughout his entire career. I mean, the thing that always interests me reading about them is, yes, there's this sort of, adventurous spirit. There's like the juvenile fun. There's venture fiction. But there's also this like, who do they work for? What is their awareness about who they work for? And what does that mean for them? How do they reflect on? And I think that is something that Pynchon does so well. Understanding people's positions within systems and
Yeah.
how those positions influence their thought patterns. And when you think about that, it's not the first thing you think of in relation to the chums, maybe, but it's absolutely there, and it's the thing that draws me to those sections is trying to analyze those patterns for sure.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't say that I have read. I am aware that there is hatred for the Chums of Chance, but I can't say that with my desire to kind of avoid spoilers for the book, given that I have not read it prior to this, that I really understand why. So I don't exactly have a take, but I'm curious, what is the overall kind of annoyance or hatred that's being directed towards that element of the novel?
I think generally what it seems to boil down to a lot of times is that people just find them to be just annoying to the point of having no purpose in the story, and that they feel like a plot element that isn't ever really important to moving the story. Like they're basically it seems like people think that they're there for a sort of comic relief from all the drama and tension that's taking place. And I think that's where the fundamental issue lies, is I think a lot of people aren't realizing how much drama and tension is going on within the chums. That whole last section of chapter 31 with the interloper is insanely tense. It's beautifully disturbing. When you start, I think, scratching a little below the surface of what's going on with the chums and the goofiness of it, and yeah, a lot of what they do tends to play like a Pink Panther film, but there's a lot going on underneath all of that. And I think Brett articulated that really well as far as like who is it they're working for, what is their purpose, like why are they doing what they're doing. Once you start really thinking about those things, I think it becomes a lot clearer that they serve a very vital purpose in this story, and that they are sort of the middle part of if you will, the Pepe Silva map that exists within this story. Like they're kind of where everything is branching out from. Like, why are they? They interact with a lot of the main characters, and it's they are they're always in the background. It seems, even when the scene's not about them, Frank is reading a book about them, or someone's talking about books that they've read about them. Like they exist in this world in such a way that is wholly unique to a lot of fiction, because the fact that they are real characters that are fictional characters in a real world.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. It's just one of those weird things, and the online disdain towards them has just always rubbed me the wrong way. But that's essentially what it is. People just kind of feel like they're an unnecessary plot point.
I think it's also so much of it seems like Pynchon is so interested in the media and narratives and the way that cultural narratives get told and sustain themselves. And like you said, Cody, Frank's reading a book about them, right? This is how all these boys are learning how to
Yeah.
right. And it just is a really important thing to show, and Pinchon pulling back the curtain it's just fascinating to me, right? Because it's not just sort of like, yes, these books are kind of propaganda on one level, but to get beyond that and understand why they are, means that they are, we have to know these characters as characters. So yeah, I think that gets cute for some people, but it certainly seems to have a purpose.
I do think that part of the hatred for the chums just comes from how pretentious pension fans can be.
That's
Where
definitely true. Yeah.
where like the chums they're not. I mean, their sections of the book. If you were just to stick them all together, I think a teenager could read them and not struggle too much. Where it's not like their sections are not nearly as adult as other sections,
Mhm.
and I think that rubs some people the wrong way.
Yeah, it seems like it has that like stylistic shift kind of feel to it that doesn't feel right, I guess, for some readers. And I think that's a good point. A lot of people, I think, tend to expect the whole thing to be this, heady, trippy, super dense thing. And when you have these moments of sort of brevity that are in there, even though the chums sections, as we've talked about, are not always just lighthearted, little jaunts. I think that's part of where that comes through. So I think that's also a good point, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, if we're like just to fully indulge in like the psychoanalysis of people who disagree with us, it does seem to a large extent that like there are people who read the satire in his more famous works like Crying of Lot 49 or V or Gravity's Rainbow as more bitter or detestable, I guess, of the subject than
Mhm.
I mean, at least I read most of it, and for the most part, we all seem to agree. And so when you get to like the chums, who are such a stand-in kind of for the modern subject as a concept, this kind of like eternal, not quite soul thing that is sure tethered to the ground, sure has a body, but you can be educated and not make the mistakes that your parents made. You can learn to think beyond the pain that you're dealing with today, and you'll never grow old if you really just never let go of that spirit of youth. And it in similar contexts where you have that kind of characterization that is as much of as linked to science and the whole STEM spectrum as the chums of chance. You're looking at Gravity's Rainbow. A lot of that stuff you can either distance yourself ironically when you're reading it and kind of relating to the characters, or you are just kind of laughing at these simple pastiches. But in the chums of chance, they are not simple pastiches. They are a very clear like example of what they are trying to represent, which is literally just youth adventurers.
Mhm.
And they are so you have to like actually take them as what they are, and then in order to actually empathize with them, to like allow yourself to be centered in that criticism that Pynchon writes about, but in a way that you have like it's such a sincere characterization. These goofy chums, they don't feel heavy, and yet when you try and put yourself in their shoes, it's so heavy. And if you are the kind of person who thinks of yourself as smart for reading Pynchon, or if you're someone who thinks, oh, most literature, it's just frou-frou stuff for ladies, and then you pick up Against the Day and you're reading this satire of what might have been your childhood favorite genre, and it's accurate, and it's also
Mhm.
like biting and implicates you both as the reader and as a person in the world for horrible things. Is that pleasant for the person who
Yeah,
read
sure.
Gravity's Rainbow because it was impressive?
Yeah. And I think that's a good point because I think I think you mentioned earlier in that statement, Will, that, V and Lot 49 and Gravity's Rainbow all have that sort of vitriol that is existing on the page, and it is kind of it's a product of an angrier young man who was writing those books. But as we talked about with Vineland, his work after that, it still carries that darkness, it still carries that weight and that anger, but there's always hope there. There's always brightness, there's a little bit more humor, there's a little more joviality, and there's more fun on the page. And I don't I hate to say that I feel like there are readers who don't want that in a Pynchon novel, especially those who are more fans of that early work. I can see how that sort of tonal shift could be off-putting in certain ways, but I think for me at least, as I've grown older, I still carry a lot of the anger towards the things going on in the world, and I still carry a lot of the um I guess just distrust of everything that's around me, but I also still have noticed as I grow older that I do have a bit more hope, whether or not it's founded in anything. We could debate about that, but I like to have that. I like to think that, like Pynchon, is putting in more and more of these books post Gravity's Rainbow, that yeah, the world's a fucked up place, but there's good people, there's good things, and we can do better. We just have to want to, and that hope is kind of, I think, what keeps a lot of us going from time to time, and gives us that momentum to kind of keep moving forward. And so I think that's what I appreciate about these kind of books, especially, is that there is that optimism that exists within them in spite of all the darkness that is being cast into these worlds.
Here, Cody. Yeah, I think,
Mm.
and I think even Gravity's Rainbow has a, a strong streak of that. Just the longing for human connection at the end.
Yeah, yeah.
The that, and I think people, the most unfair critique that I think, there are many fair, but I think the most unfair critique that gets leveled at Pynchon is that his writing is um, kind of hollow or biting or lacks a certain humanity or lacks
Mhm, mhm.
characterization. I have heard that, but just it's the prose is just reeking with all of those human qualities,
Yeah,
and
it's right there.
just, yeah. So I think, yeah, I think you're right on that element is what keeps us coming back to Pynchon, and maybe it's just a risk when your work is so overtly political, that some readers are going to want a political program out of it. But Pynchon knows enough that if his work is a political program, it's just not as interesting or
Mhm.
enjoyable. It has to be complicated, and you have to sort of find your own joy, and it has to make room for those things, or else it gets reduced, right? And if there's one thing Pynchon is aware of, it's how reduction can be troubling
Yeah,
and kind of traps us. So
yeah.
I think that's a big part of it.
Well, and I think it's important too to acknowledge that, like, what everybody pretty much has mentioned as the real central through line of this portion that keeps them invested, or the real kind of majesty of this section, is the family saga. Like all of us have mentioned how big of a deal that is, and I think
Mhm.
that goes to show exactly what the sort of line is that Pynchon is walking. And to go back to your point about him being, an angry young man, and that was what Gravity's Rainbow came out of. I think that if he writes against the day back then, there is no Travers family saga.
Oh, yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, we've said it a couple of different times, especially as we've kind of tackled his later works post hiatus, where just it is very obvious that as the man got married and had a kid and expanded his own life experience, that took on more of a primacy, or at the very least took on a new importance in depiction. Um, and to your point, Brett, it's not just exclusive to Against the Day. That seems to not be commented on very broadly across the bulk of his later work. That instead it is focused on this idea of somehow being lesser than the pre-hiatus work, a pinch on light, or that there's something lacking. When instead, I don't know if it's willful or not, but there does seem to be a particular non-recognition of the evolution in his work and what he became more interested in depicting alongside of all of the dense historical stuff.
Yeah, that I think that's great, and it's interesting. When I've only been through Shadow Ticket the once, right? But I think I've heard almost the inverse critique, right? Is that book is more at home in Milwaukee than it is when it starts to do the political stuff, right? Right?
Yeah.
And
That's
so,
my experience with it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I that's how it's as well. And so I think it's interesting to sort of see how the critical terms shift, what people look for, what they don't. But throughout it all is what keeps me coming back is just this prose, and the way this guy writes and can make ideas that are hard to express feel so lucid so often.
Yeah. So I guess a good jumping off point from there would be to discuss the characters. Does anybody have at this point, we're at the essentially almost the halfway point of the novel page length wise. Does anybody have for those of us, I guess, who have read the book before, do you have a character who you didn't maybe like as much the first time around that has grown on you, or vice versa? And then for Kate, do you have a character that you kind of are connecting with more than any others?
I suppose to answer the worst way possible, if I'm appreciating any character more than more like significantly more than the first time around, it's definitely Lake. Like
Uh-huh.
I saw absolutely no thematic depth or like and a very limited amount of humanization going on the first time through.
Mhm.
But this time, like as I've gone to great lengths to be clear about, I don't love her characterization. I've got a lot of maybe interpretations
Mhm.
that make me feel better about what happens to her and around her. But I do see that angle now, and so that's a nice change because it takes those sections from being utterly unbearable to at least tragic, I guess.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the big one for me.
Me, it's probably the chums, which we've already kind of gone over the chums a good amount in this episode. But the first time I read this book, I was so on the chums, kind of more ambivalent, where I didn't look forward to them coming back whenever I was reading it, but I also didn't dislike their sections either. This time around, it's kind of grown on me a little bit more. They've grown on me a little bit more in terms of enjoying their sections and kind of even. I mean, they all kind of blurred together. My first read,
Mhm.
we're and this read, they've kind of. I've realized that they are kind of more individual and each have their own. They each have their own like quirks and stuff. Um, yeah, and I mean, I would say Lou, but Lou has kind of disappeared for the last like 200 pages or something like that. I do think he comes back later in the book, but
Yeah.
Lou has been a favorite of mine for a while, and I did really enjoy his sections through this read through. So
I think for me, the character that always stands out in the first couple of parts of the book is Merle Rideout. And
Mm.
and that might be just because he one of the first things we hear him say is that East Moline is the ball lightning capital of the world, and that's where I'm coming to you from. But one
Oh, okay.
block from
Oh,
East Moline.
Nice.
So there's a certain I don't I this is a very like this was I think first I really pinch on writing about the Midwest. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think that sticks with me just because of personal experience with the geography and the culture and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
That's a character that stood out. Always attracted to characters in Pinchon who are kind of apart from the systems of the time, kind of doing their own thing. I think Merle fits that bill. Not always for the best, but definitely in ways that that are engaging to read about. So that's always a character that jumps out to me in this first part of the novel.
I think for me, it is I so in the times that I've read this book before, I've always enjoyed Frank's subplot within the book, but I think in doing this closer read of it, I have really gained an appreciation for the complexity of his character. I think in the past I've always kind of seen his story as the typical sort of revenge story. You know, his dad is killed and he goes out and tries to find the people responsible and this and this and this. But in seeing his sort of dynamic character come out of the page more in ways that I guess I hadn't really appreciated in previous reads, I'm just finding him a lot more interesting, especially in these last few chapters where, you know, we have his peyote trip and the scene, you know, where he finally confronts and kills Sloat. Um, but everything up to that, all those little moments of him just kind of by himself or talking with his father's ghost and ruminating on what's going on is so fascinating and so well done and such a really interesting way to look at him as a character. And I've really grown to love him way more than I thought I was going to in this reread. So but other than that, I mean, you know, we mentioned the chumps and the chums,
The
and
chumps.
they might as well be the chumps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, and you know, to Kate's point, like this is also for me the most in depth reading of a book I have done. Granted, we've done the other books for the show, but the sheer amount of time that we have spent on this book and the you know just this being our I don't even know how many damn years we've been doing this podcast at this point, but we've gotten, you know, we've gotten to know each other better. We've gotten to do a better job of evaluating and analyzing the text. And so I think, you know, getting to this point and being able to approach this book the way we have has really helped me develop a lot more, like fill in a lot of the holes, I guess, that were always kind of in there. You know, despite the fact that I love this book as much as I do, there's always parts of it I've kind of felt were maybe didn't connect with me as much. So it's really fascinating to see how a character like Frank has really grown on me through this reread.
I think we've done the book or the show for 3 years now. I
Is it 3?
think it's
Feels
how
like
long
it's
we've
been
been
longer than that, but that sounds
It
about
has.
right.
Yeah. I think that I would agree with you in that really one of the standout characters for me is Frank. I really loved the Travers family patriarch up until he, you know, is sort of unceremoniously killed. I think that he is such an interesting representation of like just a tragic figure in general, but also in the kind of inherent, not necessarily failings, but difficulties in creating like substantial sort of labor mobility and labor upward movement. Like he represents this figure who has effectively given up his family in exchange for the sort of labor momentum of the early 1900s, and as a result of that, he makes a mistake in trusting the wrong person. And in acting as a surrogate father for that person instead of his own children, and then he's murdered for it because the company believes that he might be the Kieselguhr. And even then, it isn't the company who orders his execution. You know, his killer just does it on spec, essentially.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, when you look at especially the early industrial labor movements and the development of the mining institution, and especially what would happen with labor as a result kind of being dismantled decades later to the degree that it has been now largely in American society. I think that there are some very real parallels there in terms of labor leaders putting their energy in the wrong place, labor leaders trusting the wrong people, and having a outsized effect on you know the overall momentum of the country and in how we ended up with at-will employment as sort of a basic rule of law in the United States. So I think that there's some interesting historical overlap, but you know, picking a character who dies that early in the book and essentially sets into motion, you know, the events of the book isn't quite a complete answer. So I would say Frank is certainly for me, talking about that emotional core of the book, the thing that I still come back to through all of the historical analysis and through all of the additional research, I would say that it is Frank. And then my weird answer is also Scarsdale Vibe. I find him a fascinating Pinchonian villain. I don't like him, obviously, but he really represents this old era of billionaire or robber baron, and that, like, yes, they were reprehensible people, and yes, they paid, you know, incredibly under market rates for labor, to the point of poverty wages. They did everything they possibly could to increase their own largesse and to corner markets and all of that. But there used to be this sort of expectation that they did something for the public good, right? Like a lot of these early foundational, you know, what we would call billionaires now, or robber barons, built libraries or museums or donated, you know,
they brought the city up with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Whether or not for selfish reasons, yeah, they did it though.
Yeah. And there's something interesting in Vibe's insistence in helping the Travers family. Or in trying to, and you could view it as just a payoff, but man, is he persistent in trying to make things at least a little bit better for those particular characters, that I think is compelling, especially in how he kind of has a breakdown midway through this section of the book where he just loses whatever humanity that he had left in that long rant that he makes to Foley, where that really feels like a kind of emptying of whatever humanity remained in his spirit. And I think that what I find so fascinating in his character is almost a prefiguring of Nicholas Windust, who's probably my favorite Pinchon villain. In that Scarsdale Vibe, at least prior to that monologue to Foley, I think seems to probably know somewhere deep down in his soul that he has like a karmic debt, in the way that they talk about with Windust a lot in Bleeding Edge, and that he somehow needs to kind of find a way to pay that off. I mean, his train is named after a god within Hinduism, where a lot of those ideas of karmic debt or of like reincarnation and cycles of things like that come from. So I see similar sort of thematic shades to what Pinchon would eventually spend a lot more time discussing in Bleeding Edge. So those two characters I find very compelling. And then I love Dally as well. Dally's a great character, but she's not in enough of this section of the book for me to really feel a huge connection to her. But whenever she does show up, I'm always pretty excited about it.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you brought up Scarsdale and his connection to, you know, being his representation as a robber baron, or, you know, those early billionaires. Because I think it's interesting, especially that we're reading this book in 2026. And we've said this before about his other books too, but I think really and truly, when you look at the state of the world in 2026, it is bizarrely, Pinchon was kind of bizarrely foreshadowing a lot of this, because he's not necessarily predicting where things would go to an exact degree, maybe in the way that like Wallace predicted, you know, social media's rise and the video conferencing call section of Infinite Jest. But when you look at how capitalism has sort of morphed itself and had to adapt in this most sinister way to continue to allow the top to feed off the bottom as much as it does, we've replaced this idea of let's underpay workers, and if they don't want to accept that, we'll find people who will, and we'll just, you know, we'll bust up whatever unions we have to bust up, we'll break whatever knees we have to break, we'll get these people in who want to work for less, to now it's we don't want to pay people at all when we can just pay AI to do it, and we don't have any overhead with that other than the cost of running the machine itself. We don't have to pay insurance, we don't have to pay you know, any kind of benefits or anything like that. They don't need time off. So it has capitalism works in this book as such a Lovecraftian evil, and its ability to morph and change itself for the time. I kind of you can look at the monster in the Vorman expedition. You know, if you kind of look at that as the ideal, like the almost personification of capitalism as this monstrous figure and its ability to just turn itself into something completely different than what it started as, but just as sinister and just as evil. I mean, it makes this such a timeless book, and it is a sad, sad thing to say that, but you know, as we've said with a lot of his other work, like the writing has been on the wall for so long, and it's just hard to look back at where all of this started to go wrong in this book. The turn of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, sorry. And to just see how powerless everyone has been in the face of all of that. It's heartbreaking.
And that's yeah. I mean, that's really thoughtful, Cody. And Kate's talking about Garth. Like Pynchon's always surprising you, man. Like because
Yeah.
Gravity's Rainbow, the system is evil. I mean, we don't spend a lot of time with Weissman Placero, really. I mean, a little bit, but it's sort of just part of this system that's hell bent on death and destruction. And here in this book, we get a face. and that felt, I think, new to me, like reading this book.
Yeah.
Having read some other Pynchon before, when shortly after this book came out, and it's like, okay, yeah, this is different. We have a villain who we spend time with and who speaks to us and who is presented as somebody making choices with some agency. Not just a creature of whatever amorphous system exists. And maybe that is part of the hope in some ways, that like ultimately these are decisions made by individual people.
Yeah.
Even if it's really, really hard for individual people to get away from the system. So yeah, I mean, I think Garsdale Vibe is certainly a fascinating character in this book.
That's a really good point, and that you got me thinking on something that I hadn't really considered before, and that his pre-Vineland work has and it's really just Gravity's Rainbow in Lot 49 that you could say this to, have that sort of faceless antagonist that you were talking about. And then I guess Mason and Dixon kind of also does. You never really like the evil that exists in that story doesn't really have. I don't think it's unless I'm misremembering. I can't just pin
It's
it
almost
down to
entropy.
one person. It is almost entropy, yeah. But Inherent Vice, Vineland, Against the Day, Bleeding Edge, those all have character antagonists. You could put a face to the evil, you could put a name to the evil, and it's not just a concept, it's an actual physical being. And I think that's kind of what makes those books, like you said, it gives it that little bit of weird hope in that, yeah, this is just a person. A person is only a person. They don't have to be able to control us. We have an ability to overthrow that. It's not the sort of cosmic evil that we see with the system or with capitalism or the violence that is ingrained in humans. So I think that's a really interesting way to look at all of that I hadn't really considered before.
Well, and I think kind of notably along those lines, when you look at when these books were released and where that kind of division lies, you're looking at very roughly like Reaganism and
Yep.
Yeah.
that arch neoliberal idea. And just to bring it back to something said earlier, the idea of labor unions kind of losing the faith. And think about how, Scarsdale Vibe, midway through this section that starts with like this long kind of thesis on like how capitalism is changing circa 1900, how he then loses his ability to like seek a higher value.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that interact with like the fact that the death knell for labor unions as like is so kind of surface that it feels trite to point out, but it's Reagan saying we're going to fire you if you don't get back to work. It's not a new tactic. It was never anything new. It was no different. In fact, it was far kinder than sending in military to kill you.
Yeah.
But it was this kind of culmination of this hope that our era of modernity started with the idea that through rigor and logic we can make a better society. And it's not so much that we didn't, although many would argue that we didn't. It's more that what ended up being made is not some ideal in any way, even though everyone, as this book exposes, is working for an ideal through like the early 1900s. But by the time you get to 1980, not 1980, was it like 1986 when he broke the air traffic controller strike?
I believe that's
so,
yeah. I believe that's right.
Within the 8-year period, Reagan breaks the spirit of all unions in North America, and all that has changed is literally people believing him. And that does it. And it's just because, for 80 years at that point, you'd had the IWW. For 80 years at that point, almost 70, you'd had the Soviet Union. For a long time, you had so many different attempts to change things, and it all seems to always collapse back into who had the most money to start with, who's willing to kill the most people, blah, blah, blah. And so, like, it's not, weirdly, for Pynchon, it seems like he didn't stop hoping, unlike the labor unions, because this book is super hopeful, or at least it tries to be.
It's stunning. I don't have this line on the back of my copy because I have the paperback. But the hardcover has that line about the time of feckless corporate greed or unrestrained corporate greed, and then Pynchon writes, no correspondence to the present day is intended. And on the one hand, it's depressing that he said it in 2006. It can speak to that time. It can speak to our time. On the other hand, maybe there's something to we at least should know what we're dealing with. And theoretically that provides us some manual for figuring out how to get out of it. Of course, that's always easier said than done. But I think that's the way that the book outlines all the reasons to be in despair, but refuses to give into it is stubborn. But part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess let's lighten things up a little bit. And, this we have discussed, I think more. I mean, maybe not per page, but I'm curious if anyone finds this to be among his funniest works. Obviously, all of his books have a really good sense of humor within them and are riddled with jokes that are both extremely high level and also simultaneously very low brow. Where do you all find this falls as far as the comedic side of it compared to his other work?
I don't actually think it's all that funny.
Really?
I think that and perhaps it's just that the rest of the humor in this book has been overshadowed by the pool balls exploding so early in this book. But I feel like, yes, there are moments of levity and humor, like absolutely, that's a hallmark of everything he writes, but
Yeah.
I do not find myself consistently laughing in the way that I do with most of his other work. This one feels a bit more dour in its presentation to me.
Okay.
I think that there is some humor, especially early in the book. But I'm trying to think of what the really standout sort of moments of humor across this section that we've read are, and maybe it's just a lack of recency bias to the material, but like all the scenes that come to my mind are like horrifying. that sort of stick out to me.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I think you're definitely right in that the darker parts of it certainly overshadow um the humorous parts of it. I think what it is for me, I think that per page there aren't as many heavy hitting funny parts. Like you don't have a like the mechanical duck in Mason and Dixon. I think is always going to be one of my favorite pinch on bits. And you have your talking bird in Against the Day, but the pool balls comes to mind. The Archduke Ferdinand having the Yo Mama contest
Oh,
with
Jesus Christ, that's the
bar
same book,
patrons.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Fuck me, that was so long ago.
I mean the chums and their pithy kind of like back and forths, their barbs to each other and all that. Just I think what it is there's a lot more kind of one-off jokes and one-liners that are peppered through here. And so it doesn't have those big, moments of like the mechanical. I'll go back to the mechanical duck because that is it is such like a large for a comedic part of the book. It is a large part of that book. Like it takes up, I think, like 2 pages, just to tell a joke. But god damn, it's a funny joke. But you don't really get that kind of thing in Against the Day. But I think there's a lot of good barbs and jests and one-liners and puns and those little things. But yeah, the darker parts of it definitely can kind of make you forget about that, I think.
I'm gonna have to kind of come down more agreeing with Kate here, and it's not I actually disagree to a certain extent. That is that like I think there's a lot of attempted humor, and I don't know. Let me phrase that a little better. I think there's a lot of humorous stuff that happens in Against the Day, and especially in this past part. To be honest, like you got the pirate, you've got the pirate on the salsa bottle, you've got the like, you've got kind of all the details about anything that is confusing or zany are genuinely funny. They're just so disturbing, and it's kind of I think it's convenient for me that you brought up Vokanson's duck because to me, reading Mason and Dixon, the duck absolutely has hilarious lines and funny things happen around the duck, but the duck it has always been this kind of horror show element. Like
Okay.
this I haven't read Mark Fisher's Weird and the Eerie, and I know that quite a bit has been built on top of his definitions there. So forgive me, whichever it is, weird or eerie, that Pynchon strikes with the duck is kind of where I think a lot of the humor in Against the Day, and especially this second part, less so the first part, kind of ends up, which is it's funny, but it's funny in just a way that makes me personally feel like something is horrible. Something is wrong. This
Okay.
is a joke that you make because if you don't make this joke, you're gonna start crying. Or if you don't make this joke, it feels like what's happening is unrealistically evil or something.
Okay.
And
That's
so,
I like that.
that's where how I feel at the comedy in this section.
That's a good way to put it. I think maybe the way that Mason and Dixon, it feels like, Cherry Coke interpolating the story has a lot of humor in it. And in Against the Day, I feel like a lot of the humor comes from the dialogue. Like the characters talking to each other. There's a lot of like, oh, I'm up to no good kind of dialogue
Mhm.
that I find pretty funny. That there's witty, it's peppy, it's bantery, maybe a little bit like Shadow Ticket, that kind of noir style that moves along at a pretty good
Yeah.
clip. Um, and I don't find the narration as funny as Pynchon can be. But the dialogue stands out for having those qualities. So maybe it's just that it does feel funny to me, but it feels again, Pynchon's always surprising me. The humor maybe comes from different places than I'm used to seeing it. Um, in V, there's like outlandish, weird chase scenes.
Yeah.
So maybe it's uh, it does feel funny, but the humor comes from a place that as used to seeing it in his books.
That is true. Most of the humor in this book, I feel like, is interpersonal, like families interacting with one another, or the chums, or
Mhm.
things like that. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, I think a different way to put that is perhaps that the humor in this book is more subtle than in other books. Where like Inherent Vice, the humor is pretty in your face at times, kind of forefronted even. And especially in the second section, we like because the first section, it has some stuff that's pretty obviously supposed to be funny, like the Franz Ferdinand stuff. I believe that's the first section.
Yeah.
That stuff is that like I think his inclusion is basically just comic relief in this book. And but I do think, yeah, like I said, the humor is a little bit more subtle and a little bit less obvious. Where there's not like Gravity Jumbo is full of like groan inducing puns. And stuff like that, where I can't think of any groan inducing puns in this book so far. I'm sure there have been at least one or two that I'm just not thinking of because Lord knows you can't write a book without including them. But yeah.
So, just hearing people talk about Franz Ferdinand, I always y'all seen the movie Anora?
Yeah.
Just reminds me of the billionaire oligarch son, and when I saw that movie, I just couldn't stop about Franz Ferdinand in this book. So yeah,
That's a fair comparison.
Yeah.
But of course, I mean, like that does have this dark, just the Franz Ferdinand stuff does. So I think always a mix with Pinchon.
I guess
So-
at least he doesn't, threaten genocide. That's,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Point one, what's his name from Anora?
My last question is, even though we're only halfway through the book, I'm curious for everyone's thoughts on how Against the Day feels as a sort of distillation of everything that Pynchon has done. Putting aside the length of it, because obviously it is his longest book. Do you feel like this would be, if you were to recommend to someone a Pynchon book, aside from putting aside length, that's no object. They're not going to complain about, oh well, it's too long. It's I don't have time to read something like that. Just on the back of its prose, of its character work, of its thematics, of its world building, of all of that. Do you think that this is, at this point, the best representation of what he is capable of as a writer, or would you place it below a certain other book, or even further down the list?
Probably, I would say yes to that. I know that Gravity's Rainbow is probably the one that a lot of people are going to go to immediately. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that he's written more books post hiatus than pre hiatus. And so, like, if we're looking at it specifically on communication of ideas and what he is capable of in his writing, I don't think I can point to, at least with this book so far, any other book of his that gives a better showcase of that. I mean, several of the people on this episode have mentioned how there are so many different points of this book that should feel like pastiche, but that are not. And that instead he's just succeeding at writing, a Western, or writing an epistolary novel, or writing a boy's adventure novel, or whatever it may be. And as I said kind of at the top of the episode, in my opinion, with this book's really serving, I think, as a capable Rosetta Stone for the rest of his bibliography. Yeah, I think that without the objections of length or sort of time investment or any of that, if we're just going principally on showcasing what Pynchon is capable of a writer and the communication of the ideas that he's interested in, I don't think I could pick a better one.
I think that's a great answer. I'll take Kate Spade though, and well, I guess it kind of depends on whether I like care what the person I'm recommending this book thinks about me.
Yeah.
If I'm worried it's going to reflect back up, like if I'm recommending other, I'd recommend Gravity Rainbow.
Yeah.
But I think that would be my answer to a stranger on the internet, because I think all those elements novel. It remains to me the most impressive novel. I can't believe a human being wrote it. I think I'd go with Gravity's Rainbow, but this one certainly has all of those elements that Pynchon is so great at. And as I think we've talked about, it might be a little overstuffed. I'd love to be able to say Mason and Dixon, but I think that book is unique for Pynchon, and so it's focused on characters. So I'm not sure it provides a like an archetypal Pynchon experience. So I think it's a great question, Cody. This book does feel to me like the one that showcases all of the different things that he cares about, all of the pet themes, the way he can do dense theoretical stuff as well as close character work, the way that he can imitate different genres, his understanding of history and geography. All of that is in here. Um, you know, partially because it's such a long book.
Yeah.
So, so yes, I guess my short answer is yes. Um, Maybe my surprise answer is I might recommend V because I think everything he does kind of stems from there too.
Okay.
And it's half as long, so that's the Moneyball answer, I guess. But yeah, I mean it's a great question. Can I just name every Pynchon novel? You should
Sure.
read all of them. Read them all.
Yeah.
Read them all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, y'all know me. I love obscurantism, and I love hate. I think hating the audience is the right way to approach creating art. Um, and so of course, Gravity's Rainbow is gonna like it resonates in that kind of deep way with me.
Sure.
And the kind of an interesting dynamic that I don't know if you started thinking along these lines when you were saying it, Brett, but you kind of outlined a dichotomy there where like almost Gravity's Rainbow is a kind of a book of its time. It is cynical and cutting edge in the arts, in the artistic avant-garde. It is right at the forefront. And it's someone who's in his early 30s writing it, and it's it's a book that is trying to address the current moment and does so very well. If the rumors of that moment have been passed down clearly, it succeeded. And as such, because it so perfectly encapsulated a moment, it is kind of timeless. On the other hand, Against the Day is not a book of its time. It's definitely more of, maybe not more self-consciously a timeless work, but it's definitely a work that is less rooted in the immediate context of its authorship. And part of that is, him being an older man. Part of it is, I think, maybe related to the youth, but kind of an understanding that no one person is going to write a trilogy of novels that redefine society. Like it seems like he kind of had, half-hearted, maybe self-consciously foolish, quixotic, even ambitions to that effect. And he, kind of got his head out of his ass by the time he got Mason and Dixon out there. And so it's kind of hard for me to not cheat and say like Gravity's Rainbow and Mason and Dixon because they are such perfect opposites.
Mm-hmm.
But as I've said all this, I can't help but say that no, that lays out Against the Day if you can tolerate the length. And I think it's a big issue, and it's not one we've run into yet, but we absolutely are about to hit it. Against the Day, I would say, really wants the reader to get worn out. And it's doing something deep and thematic, and the way it wears you out, I think, is maybe not enjoyable, but satisfying. And again, it all works, but it's, I don't know if you can say that that's really like a perfect work of art, right? If it is and not hate the audience kind of thing, like, a moose once bit my sister. It's actually like maybe make the audience feel horrible for months. I don't know if that's something we should allow as like as people who like books. Maybe we shouldn't do that.
Here I thought recommending Against the Day would be the kind choice, but I guess compelling case for the opposite, for sure.
I think for me that Mason and Dixon is, in my opinion, probably his most virtuosic work, uh, where it's the most like technically impressive to me. Where he, with the frame story that he kind of continually returns to, and just the voice of that book is kind of singular, as Brett kind of talked about, and as I think we talked about back then. In terms of his other books, like none of his books are really like Mason and Dixon. And in some ways, I do think that for a lot of people, of his longer books at least, it's probably his most digestible. There's some step deeper in Mason and Dixon that is gonna freak out the squares a little bit, maybe, but it's not quite as in your face about that kind of stuff as Gravity's Rainbow or Against the Day can be. But yeah, I mean, we've already kind of been over this ad nauseum. But Against Today is kind of, in my opinion, probably the purest distillation of Pynchon's worldview and what he's trying to say about the world in his books. I think he kind of accomplishes that and with his most clarity, or you can see his worldview with the most clarity in Against Today. So it just kind of depends on who I'm recommending it to and stuff like that. And I have a soft spot for Inherent Vice, where I just feel like Inherent Vice is just kind of fun and funny, and it also has some deep themes and stuff like that. But yeah,
no, that's a good point. I think for me, it's I would recommend it on the grounds of it being clearly a book written by an author who loves to read, and I think that shines through with his portrayals and the way he is endearingly portraying these genre fiction works that usually don't get a lot of love. Westerns have never really been seen as the high point of literature. The boys' adventure novel has never been seen as the high point of literature. These are always, sci-fi fantasy stuff. It's always been kind of looked down on as this, tropey, schlockily written, just no merit to it, this and this and this. But I think that part of what he is doing in this book is showing the passion that he has for those books and how those books were foundational for him coming up as a young reader and then as a writer who continued to read. Because I think, and I'm sure all of you will agree with me, any writer worth their salt is also a reader, and anyone who says that they write but don't read is full of shit. I think that this book, if nothing else, if you put aside even all the historicity in it, all of the insane technical writing that's going on within there, I think at the end of the day, if you just take it even at a surface level, it's just an incredible piece of work by an author who is so passionate about reading and wants to read so broadly and wants people to read so broadly that he found a way to take multiple genres that are often maligned and ridiculed and turn them into this beautiful, sprawling work that is cohesive and brilliant and poetic, and it's an insane accomplishment.
I love that, Cody, and just to add quickly, you can feel how much Pynchon loved Warlock in this section. We finished
Oh
right
God, yeah,
Definitely.
yeah.
It's just you're right. That's absolutely.
Well, and I wonder if we shouldn't mention that, especially, I think Against the Day, especially uh, compared to, well, not compared. I think Against the Day, especially amongst all of his books, is maybe the most representative of what, at least my understanding of what the postmodernism, meta-modernism kind of idea is supposed to be. And at least in terms of his works, I'm not saying it's
Right.
If you take this as a very serious philosophy and you have a different opinion, please write in. But I'm just saying, for Pynchon's standpoint, this is kind of all of the big aspects of that. What differentiates meta modernism from postmodernism are clearly here in Against the Day, and I think that complicates this conversation, because Pynchon is and has been, because of the way academics and literary influence has worked in the past 50 years, has become like metonymous with the idea of American postmodern culture. And so for him to be, in his probably 50s for the most part writing this book, and to be still with it is, impressive on one hand, but it does mean that can we consider it representative of younger Pynchon? Because I mean, I would argue that point of view, that attitude has always been in his works, maybe post V. But hey, like Brett said, I personally might hate V, but it's really representative of a lot of Pynchon's early work, and there's a lot of it even in his later work. And so, can you really say Against the Day is the most typical because of that kind of issue? I don't know.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. I don't think I've thought of Against the Day that way before, but it certainly makes sense. And yeah, no, I think that's really thoughtful.
Yeah.
This is the first time Brett's appeared for this book. I figured it might be a good idea to ask what your sort of history with Against the Day is, and kind of where it sits in your understanding of Pynchon's bibliography and your enjoyment of those books.
Yeah, no, I think Against the Day came out when I was 2006, right? So I would have been a sophomore in college, and I had not been introduced to Pynchon yet. I think I read it after I read Gravity's Rainbow, probably 2 to 3 years after it came out. And I was drawn to it the first time, but this was a book that took me 2 reads, I think, to like understand or appreciate. And I still I honestly I think there are parts of Against the Day that are as opaque to me as anything in Pynchon. And mostly around some of those kinds of things. So I don't know. I mean, I remember having this weird sort of like paradoxical experience with this book the first time, and even the second time, where parts of it just absolutely I just ripped through in a way that I had never ripped through Pynchon before. And I think that's a big part of why I think this part two, stands out to me as among my favorite, because I remember ripping through this part.
Yeah.
And just and not having had that experience with Pynchon before, it was awesome. And then, other parts of it didn't connect with me as much, and I think I remember feeling a little bit weird, like, wait, am I actually interested in plot? Like, do I want Pynchon to do more plot? So I think it was a book that challenged me in that way.
Yeah.
It's maybe the book that I find the most mysterious still.
Okay.
Which is weird, because it is also quite also one of the more accessible books, despite the length, like just the quality of the prose and the magnetism of the plot. So my relationship with this book is, I think, very complicated. I hope that answers your question, Kate. It's a lot. It's just,
Sure,
I'm not
yeah.
quite sure I can, because I didn't.
Luke, what were you going to ask?
Yeah, mine is more of a statement, I guess. It's something I've been thinking over, and I do want to get y'all's opinions on it, especially Brett's, because it relates to his favorite character. I've been thinking about how, like, you can view Merle. Like, Merle is very charismatic. I think we can all agree on that. He's very fun to read. Seems like he'd be a fun hang and stuff like that. But I do think that there's like a dark side to his character that I think that we've been somewhat ignoring. We've gone over it a little bit. But I'm just to cite my where I'm coming from. And we're introduced to him, and he tries to sell his daughter, which like can be interpreted as a joke. Was most likely a joke, especially like with later stuff. But so there's that. There's the fact that you can read Erlis leaving him as because of something related to pornography. That's kind of more open ended and stuff, but that is pretty damning to me, at least, when I like if that you can at least interpret it that way. And then probably the worst part about it is like Dally is like 12 or 13 whenever, and it's said that like Merle like makes an arrangement with the brothel madame to like have her sexual education, but like that arrangement could have involved money going back and forth. It's not clear. And I mean, Dally, to kind of defend how we've been reading Merle, is Dally doesn't seem traumatized by any of this. Dally seems to have to be very fond of her father. Erlis herself doesn't seem to hold a grudge against him, but I do think that there is kind of a dark side to him that is kind of masterful by Pynchon to include, because and it's also like he's probably the most charismatic character in the book so far, at least, where he's kind of the most like purely fun to read, and like he's always having a good time. Seems like like I said, like he'd be a good hang. But Pynchon does include these kind of more open-ended interpretations that you can do of his character that are just really dark. And I wanted to know what y'all, especially Brett, I guess, since he was his favorite character, what y'all thought about that idea.
Yeah, I mean, and I'd love to hear what others think as well. I think there are, it's always hard when somebody asks like, "Who's your favorite Pynchon character?" Because you're like racking
Mhm.
your brain for like, well, which one is acceptable and which ones are not going to have those edges, but they all do. They all have the edges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I put it quite well, Luke. Like I don't. There's always smoke around these characters. I mean, Merle seems certainly like the character most likely to believe in some crazy ass conspiracy, right? Right? Because he's just tinkering off his own, apart from all of these systems. He kind of prioritizes, it seems like, a certain kind of independence. Um, and so there's also like loneliness, maybe, or darkness lurking around the edges. Um, I think you're also right that that's maybe part of the charisma. Um, I think why I am drawn to those characters in Pynchon is because they do seem kind of representative of how I see him as a writer. Um, just like Pynchon is just a dangerous dude. His work is easily misinterpreted, I think. His work is hard to understand. His work kind of rejects ideas that might be worth holding, right? Right? Like it rejects understand or like the traditional systems of knowing the world, right? In
Mhm.
ways that can be dangerous. It kind of embraces paranoia. Um, so I think maybe that's part of why I'm drawn to Merle is because I see that in a lot of his other stuff. Um, and again, the sort of like there's a geographical element there as well. Um, but yeah, so it's his independence. It's how he exists outside of the systems. It's how he represents the kind of danger that I think Pynchon always sort of plays with. Um, I think that's how I would put it. I don't know. I'm curious how you all feel about that because I definitely agree that there's something around Merle and around a lot of these characters that you're not quite sure how dark it is or what it is, but it definitely feels like enough to give you pause.
I think that if you go back to some of the earliest episodes that we did, I had misinterpreted a joke that he made with Dally to imply that like he was actually willing to sell his child. So I do think that there is some deliberate, to kind of Brett's point, ambiguity, and you don't know how real these things are. You don't like, Merle is involved in the earliest forms of pornography, and he does get his daughter a job as a powder monkey in a a gold mine, and of course does take Dally to a brothel. But I think that what I come back to is the conversation we had when that happened in the book. I don't remember what episode that was, but the kind of, if I remember correctly, the kind of consensus that we came away from as a couple of sort of hosts discussed it was the fact that Merle, much like a lot of people at the time, have no clue how to raise their children,
Mhm.
much less have no clue how to raise their their female children. That
Yeah.
there is a distinct separation between fathers and their family in a lot of instances, and especially fathers and daughters. That the only thing that he could possibly think of to educate his daughter on sex and the ways in which men will at times try to use her for that is to take her to a brothel. Um, and that's not great. Like, there's a lot. There's about a million better ways to go about doing that with your child. But unfortunately, I think that there is probably some truth to the fact that happened. Um, and this is certainly not the only kind of Western that I've seen that kind of an education take place with. Not necessarily always with a daughter of a character, but I have definitely seen that trope played out in fantasies and Westerns with sons and their fathers, or sons and their sort of like mentor or counselor or something like that. So I think that for me, that stuff with Merle is meant to kind of be twofold. One, to show that like he is still trying. Like he doesn't
Mhm.
he especially at that point in the book, he is aware that Dally is becoming an adult and is going to be having sort of as she gets older, is going to be having adult interactions with people, and that is part of it. And he grasps his own sort of uselessness to educate, and so this is the idea that he comes up with, and maybe it's not a good one, certainly not an ideal one, but it's what he can think to do. So I think that's part of it, is as meaning to illustrate the fact that he does care, but that also just a lot of people failed to be able to take care of their kids. And I mean, there are multiple examples in this book of fathers that just don't have a connection to their family, or fathers that just don't have a connection to their children. I mean, Merle is one of them. Of course, like the whole situation with Lake, and to a lesser extent the other Travers kids and their father is another one of them. So I think it's also sort of the failures of parenting, or of the kind of family unit at this time in history, is also something that Pynchon has on his mind in the book. So, I think that, yeah, I think there is supposed to be some degree of deliberate ambiguity, or something that's meant to put the reader on edge a little bit in that, especially given how young she is in the book. But I think that ultimately it is meant to point towards a man who is trying his best, and his best isn't maybe particularly great, but it's what he is capable of doing, and so that's what he's going to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. Just part of this conversation, like Merle is an interesting case study for a dissertation that I'm sure exists, or that I would certainly be interested in reading, which is like, I'm always interested in Pynchon's relationship to pornography and gambling, because they're things that come up so much in his book.
Yeah.
And he doesn't treat them like vices necessarily, but he doesn't embrace them either. And so, like everything, there's this sort of nuanced position with regard to those things, and he's very worried about sexual control. And the this intro he wrote to 1984, and certainly in Gravity Rainbow, and so all of those. Merle certainly touches on a lot of those themes. The gambling stuff, there's a lot of gambling stuff that I think especially comes up later in the book, and Against the Day. Pynchon's relationship to those two things is sort of very interesting to me, and something I've always sort of wanted to take a closer look at. So maybe somebody already has. I hope so. If folks know of those kinds of things, I hope they'll write to me, or you all if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really disagree with anything any of y'all have said. I mean, the thing is, I've been the most ardent Merle defender on the show, I think, and that's not going to change. But for the sake of conversation, let's absolutely assume that like everything that I read as like a coy line or a wink at the fact that like people are going to assume the worst about a single father, or talking about, or like let's assume that he hasn't just taken her to a brothel so she can watch. He's taken her to a brothel, and like you said, might have happened, Luke. Maybe there's some money going back to Merle. Maybe she's doing work for the brothel. It could be truly horrendous. We do have to choose how we're interpreting him, and I personally I'm gonna interpret him as a hero, but that's entirely because I've chosen to. Like I think the wholly like almost evil reading of Merle is on the page if you want it to be there, and I think what I kind of have to do with that as I think about him as a maybe not symbol but as resonant with certain themes is well maybe the fact that like Dally comes out of her childhood feeling pretty fondly towards her old pop, and pretty we only get the first beginnings, but I don't think it will surprise Kate to find that she's not going to immediately warm to Erlis. Things are going to be a little chilly there, and that's what it is. And so I kind of what it kind of says about Merle that he makes these jokes, even if it's not whether or not they are just jokes, whether or not he is a person who should not be left with a child for 5 minutes. He had the capacity to be that evil. He had the capacity to be as good as we would like him to be. And the fact that he is not her father, and the fact that he is like a middle-aged man who has no real point of contact with a young girl other than him being there, and the fact that he's able to at least raise her well enough to be an independent person who's self-possessed, and in relation to all of the other feminist themes in Against the Day, I'm sure there's a lot of depth to plumb. Like what it says, I mean, is kind of just parenting is what it is. The kid comes out, and you got to do what you got to do, and maybe the best is this random amalgamator who's huffing mercury fumes all the time, and maybe it isn't. But in this case, it was. It was Dally. Dally seems pretty great. She's of the youth. She's doing the best by far, and that's kind of funny because she's not exactly like she's not like starting a career or going to school or any of the things that are like signs of success. But she is like a person, and a real person in a way that like Kit kind of isn't at this point, and in a way that Reef is struggling to be, and that Frank might be, but he doesn't seem super happy with how his life is going anyway. So, that's kind of beside the point for him.
I guess just as a brief end note to what Will said, and I would certainly agree with what you've said there, Will. I think that's what makes the moment where Erlis reveals to Dally that her father is not her, biological father so impactful. Because suddenly I think that does apply a different lens to Merle's choices and Merle's struggles in raising her, where it's just like this was not what he anticipated his life was going to be probably at all. But despite that, he has done his absolute best and his absolute utmost to raise this kid, despite having no legal reason to do so. Like no legal reason to do so, no sort of traditional reason to do so. He's just doing it obviously out of love, but as you're mentioning, he is a crazy amalgamator who's huffing mercury fumes all the time. So, his judgment is impaired at the very least. And that he can exist as something of a genuine parental figure for her, in a way that her mother seemingly has little interest in being, adds a lot of emotional weight to the scene and retroactively changes the reader's experience with, I think, a lot of the things that he says and does prior.
So then I have one question specifically for Brett. So I don't know if you might have been slightly misleading, in which case death for perjury. But assuming you haven't been misleading us, you've probably heard Kate and I go on and on about how we dislike the particular usage of the Iceland Spar device so far in the book.
Yes.
How do you feel on that issue, and do you think it gets made up for going forward?
I'm just going to answer the question as honestly as I can. I I think for me, I find the Iceland Spar thing to be useful, and it does pay off, but it does recur few too many times for my for my liking. I mean, I think maybe this also just sort of part of what Kate asked about sort of my relationship to this book, which is I'm more drawn to parts of this book than I am to anything Pynchon has ever written. Um, I also really struggle sometimes to understand certain metaphors that he's using, and the Iceland Spar is one of them. And you know, I understand parts of the metaphor, and I think they pay off. Um, but I think I wonder if it's a metaphor that has a lot piled on top of it. Does that answer the question, Will? I don't know if that's entirely satisfying for you, but
Well,
I
it,
hope
it, it
so.
answers enough to qualify as vindication, so huzzah.
Okay.
But no, I,
Okay.
I do see what you're saying, and I appreciate you putting it out there. I hear it.
All right. So I guess we'll start wrapping it up here. We did have one question that came through on Blue Sky that I wanted to put out for everybody. Um, someone on Blue Sky, under the name Matrix Swayze, love it. Asked, "Have y'all ever done a mailbag episode? I'm interested in learning how you handle reading multiple books at the same time." As I mentioned in reply on that on Blue Sky, we've not done a mailbag episode. I honestly hadn't considered doing one, but I like the idea of it. We generally just anytime we get correspondence, we just read it on whatever episode we happen to record next. So the idea of doing a mailbag episode intrigues me at least. But that's a conversation that the rest of us can have down the road. But as far as how I can only speak for myself here, how I read multiple books at the same time, I kind of have to. Um, it keeps me from getting burned out. If I just read one book, I tend to find myself not always having enough interest to keep my momentum going. And if I don't have something to read when I don't feel like reading that one particular book, I just kind of get stir crazy and I find other things that I maybe don't necessarily want to do. So I just kind of like having something else there. I try to balance it and have something if I'm reading something really big and heavy and dense, I try to balance that with something kind of lighter and a little easier to read. Or I might have like a nonfiction book that I'll read on the side or something. With Against the Day or with any of really any of the books that we do for the show, it's a little bit easier because we're breaking them into smaller segments, and I can just kind of focus on that specific segment. I know that I'm starting here and stopping here. Granted, I'm spending more time between those pages, but I at least know, like, this is all I need to worry about for right now. I don't need to necessarily, even if I feel compelled to keep going, I don't have to. So I can just pick something else up. So it's really just kind of like my brain likes having that juggling act going on. I know not everybody does, but mine kind of needs it in a weird way.
Have you always sounds like you've always been like that, Cody. Is that right?
Oh yeah. Even as a kid, I would have like a Goosebumps book that I was reading, and then like I had Lord of the Rings in the background. I just like to have something going on, something that I'm reading at the time. I feel weird if I don't. Um, and that's also kind of helps. It's helped me branch out into other genres and other types of reading. Like I didn't really ever read a whole lot of comics until around like early college. I started reading some like graphic novels and stuff, and um, over the last few years, my son got me into some of the like I say some because there's so many goddamn titles. Like a very small handful of manga that he was reading. I read Full Metal Alchemist a few years ago and absolutely loved it. I'm reading One Piece right now and it's really damn good. Um, but it's really long. But it's an easy one. That's one of those ones where I can like breeze through it in a little while, and it's just kind of like a palate cleanser, and I can get back to something heavier a little bit down the road. But yeah, I go crazy if I don't have at least a couple of books going at the same time.
That's impressive. I feel like I'm always trying to learn how to read multiple books at once, and it just never works. I
Yeah,
don't know.
I mean,
I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just something you are who you are.
it's
I'd be
everyone's
curious
wired
to
a little different.
yeah, I'd be curious to know. I would be curious to hear from people for reading multiple books at once as an acquired skill if they exist. I don't know. I, I would love to know. I, it's a great question from Patrick. You'd expect nothing less.
Yeah.
I would be one of those people who's acquired that skill.
Yes,
Brad.
teach us. Teach me.
Man, for me, as lame as it's gonna sound, it came out of necessity. Like when I was a kid, I read, as I believe I've said on the podcast a couple different. I've read mostly nonfiction when I was a kid, but I never finished any of them. So like, if I was to have sort of a Goodreads or a reading tracker for the reading I did when I was, I don't know, 10 to 15 or whatever the ages would have been, I probably started and never finished about 60 World War II history books. And so I think part of it was that I was like a mood reader or a person of individual sort of taste at the time and just couldn't settle on anything. And then eventually when I started reading fiction, I just would read one book at a time, and it was because I would get so immersed into the world, and just kind of the atmosphere that a particularly well written book is able to generate, sort of in your head, that kind of vivid hallucination quality of really good fiction books. And I had a great streak of one book at a time for like 10 years or more. And then eventually what started to happen is when I was in college, when I was in seminary, I had to read a bunch of different books at once. And then I still wanted to read just for fun outside of the educational reading that I was doing. And then eventually that carried over into being a part of book clubs in real life, but then wanting to just continue to read books for myself on the side. And then eventually that leads me to the podcast, where now I'm reading a book for my book club that I have with my friends, and then a book that I'm reading for myself. But then there's also a book that we're covering on the podcast. And so for lack of having another option, I have ended up with that skill. And for the most part, it's easily navigable. I will say 2026 has been a nightmare for me. I have not finished a book in like a month and a half, and it's
I'm in the same
driving me a
boat.
little insane at this point. But yeah, I don't think I would choose to read multiple books at once, but just as a result of the life I live, it is what I have to do now.
Yeah, I feel like I should invent some draconian punishments for myself if this is a skill I really want to learn. I'm certainly more in the just need to finish what I start. It's probably like the one way in which I'm a pretty strict rule follower. It's like it feels wrong to not finish a book. Other ways, not it doesn't bother me. But it's good to hear that it's possible. You give me hope. Thank you.
I feel like if it is something you're wanting to train yourself to do, like what I would recommend you do is get like Borges's complete fiction or something along those lines, where it's like 500 to 700 pages of just short stories that you're going to have to jump in and out of anyway, and then just sort of read another book alongside, and just either on like a lunch break or on a Saturday morning or whatever, you just read a little bit of those short stories, and then that I think can maybe help you build up some, I don't know, neuroplasticity for switching settings or themes between one author and another.
Yes, I need that for sure. That's good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, personally, if I'm reading the most efficient way, then I'm gonna be reading one nonfiction book, one heavy fiction book, and one lighter fair fiction book. But as I've let on a little bit in the past year, that's not my norm. And that's it. I definitely it's definitely not Maybelline for me. And I suppose if there's anything I have to say to explain it, is I don't do the whole like I basically never get like absorbed in the movie of a book personally. That's just not how I cogitate, I guess. And so for me, it's never an issue where I come back to a book and think I can't quite get back in the mode I was in. And so the only advice I can give you, Brett, is maybe I think having music, like that, at least a genre that you associate with a book, can help set the tone if you can tolerate music with while you're reading. And then also maybe Finnegan's Wake, because you have to believe to to read that one. And I think that's a good muscle for reading a dozen books at a time, like I want to.
I like it. I like it. That's helpful. So you're all nice enough to invite me on the show to blather about Pinchon and teach me how to read multiple books at once. So you have my thanks.
No guarantees of my advice.
I blame my ability to read multiple books at once on the fact that I'm ADHD. With I am medicated, so I am capable of focusing, I guess. But what I'm doing right now is I'm going through against today. Obviously, I'm reading Infinite Jest along with Kate and Cody. And then I'm reading a novel, and then I'm reading 3 books of short stories. And that would basically be my advice. Would just be, don't read 2 novel. If you're trying to practice reading more than one book, I would do like a novel and a book of short stories, or a novel and some nonfiction or poetry, or I think you get where I'm coming from with that. And I used to be more. I used to be more that I would read one book at a time, and I would do like binge reading a lot of the time. But that I kind of lost steam with that. I don't really know exactly what changed. Maybe it was just I didn't get medicated for ADHD till I was in my mid-20s. And before that, I'll get like I had problems with like hyper focus, more so than like lack of focus, at least when it came to reading. Um, but yeah, grad school also helped with training me to read multiple books at one time, because like Kate, I wanted to read what I wanted to read, stuff for fun, and then I had to be reading a lot of times 2 or 3 books for my classes. And so yeah, I mean, it's just practice. And again, just I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't try to, especially if you're trying to learn how to read more than one book at once. I wouldn't read like 2 novels or 2 books of short stories at once. I would try to change it up a little bit.
That's good advice. Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah, in summary for the listeners, it sounds like our advice is post-secondary education primarily. So get on that.
It'll do a lot for you. Not always positive.
Yes, minister.
All right. Well, if there isn't anything else that anyone wants to talk about, wanted to give another thank you to Brett for coming back on the show, and lending his talents in the Pinchonian realm to our humble podcast. Brett, is there anything you're working on currently, or anywhere where listeners can find you or your work?
I'll have a book coming out in August with Broken Tribe Press. It's a book of very short stories, also fictional liberal arts school in Illinois. So call it a deconstructed campus novel. So stay tuned. Coming out in August, I believe. So we'll hopefully be sending out some links and doing some pre-orders in the coming months. I'm really grateful for you all having me on again. It's always a joy to talk about our greatest living writer. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, of course.
I, for one, am very excited at the concept of your book, so I will definitely give that a read when it comes out at the end of the year. So yeah, until next time, you can get in touch with us at any of our many different social media links and email. Send in any comments or questions that you have for either us, or for the sort of end of Against the Day in your interpretations or things you may have some curiosity around that we can expand on our next recording. You can get in touch with us there at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We are also on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone Pod. We're on Twitter at PinchOnPod. We are on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, where we certainly do take any comments that you may have and read those out on the shows as well. And we're there just at Mapping the Zone Podcast. If you think our show is worth $1 and you would love to part with that $1, we would love to have it in order to help pay our hosting costs and other expenses that come up with running the show. And you can do so at our Ko-Fi project that we are on Ko-Fi at Mapping the Zone. And any of those funds, as I always say, are used to pay for hosting costs and for hopefully eventually one day maybe hiring an editor so Cody can rest, and any books that we may need or additional supplies in order to make the show happen for you. Another way to support the show would be through purchasing some merch from our spread shop. We do have some basic logo t-shirts up there currently, as well as other products that you can get our lovely logo designed for us by Brad per second. We do also have a Infinite Jest themed t-shirt with the original slogan of the Enfield Tennis Academy, designed by Luke himself. There will be other stuff added to that shop probably in the near future, so keep your eyes peeled there. And until next time, thank you all for listening.
Bye.
See ya.
I'm just going to assume that the entire wall of his shower exploded outwards.
It looks like a parody of like a retrofuturist design of a shower. Like,
It's crazy.
It's so over the top. I don't.
It's
Are you supposed to adjust the nozzles to change like the direction of the stream and then punch in those discs at a certain rhythm in order to get a right temperature? Like, I don't know.
I mean, even stranger is like the 3 discs seem to have holes in them as if water could shoot out of them as well. So
But they're not like evenly distributed, so it's not like some very early like shower massager.
Yeah, I have no clue. And then just the 4 white handles and it's telling that the least strange thing about this photo of somebody's shower is the shelf.
Yes.
That is freestanding in the tub.
It's quite something, really.